The top officials of Hitler's Germany stand trial before the world. They are charged with transforming warfare into a method of mass civilian extermination, as well as committing acts of violence and theft. This trial, known as Nuremberg, has had a global impact and will be released in theaters on March 3rd. Hello, friends. 79 years ago marked the peak of the Nuremberg trial, a pivotal international military tribunal focused on prosecuting war criminals. The recent film Nuremberg, directed by Nikolai Lebedev, explores this historic trial and features music from Eduard Artemiev, one of the renowned composers of our time. It centers on the proceedings of the trial, and guess who portrayed the main Russian prosecutor, Rudenko? That's right, it was Bezrukov. Who better to take on that role? It's evident that discussions about Nuremberg will intensify in the coming days. As May 9th approaches each year, the media reports on the trial, sparking conversations, new interpretations, and the emergence of additional facts. In light of this, we decided to release our content a bit earlier. Generally, it seems that by now most people understand the Nuremberg trials. The Nazis and fascists were responsible for horrific acts, and that is why they faced conviction. However, if we rewind and reflect on the events, what struck me most is how systematically these atrocities unfolded. The mass killings operated like a well-oiled machine, almost like a conveyor belt. Very few people were aware of these horrors. The general public had no knowledge until journalists reached the concentration camps liberated by the Soviet Army and the Allies. Everything I'm about to discuss in this video was not only shocking, but left people utterly speechless, as Europe had never experienced such horrors before or since. Now, let's take it step by step and explore the origins of this process. By 1943, as the Allied coalition of the Americans, British, and Soviet Union began to gain the upper hand against Hitler's Germany, a pressing question emerged. What should be done with the war criminals? At that point, the scale of crimes committed, particularly in the Soviet Union, was becoming evident. These atrocities included desolate villages, accounts of concentration camp abuses, torture and bullying, as well as extensive looting and the theft of museum collections. Similar atrocities were occurring in France and Poland, and this information was known. For the first time, on October 30th, 1943, the Allies signed the Moscow Declaration, which stated their intention to hold war criminals accountable. What followed were remarkable revelations. I won't downplay this because I was unaware of them myself. The Allies had a different perspective on the process. While everyone called for punishment, few initially advocated for a trial. The Americans suggested selecting a number of war criminals to be executed without any formal proceedings. The proposed method was hanging, but Churchill argued against it, deeming it inhumane. He believed they should be shot instead. Furthermore, he provided Stalin with detailed lists of Nazi criminals to be executed without trial, arguing that a court wasn't necessary since the evidence was already clear. Churchill emphasized that the upcoming proceedings should be political rather than strictly legal. He argued that it was essential to demonstrate to the world that the aggressors would be held accountable and that punishment would extend to everyone involved. Notably, U.S. President Roosevelt echoed this sentiment. stating that Germans should not be categorized as good or bad. Rather, the entire German population should face consequences for the atrocities committed. This is how the idea of collective guilt among Germans initially emerged. Regarding the proposed lists, estimates included as many as 50,000 individuals, encompassing all levels of leadership within the Nazi regime, from senior officials to those in various mid-level positions. The proposed list included members of the SS, Gestapo, the NSDAP party, and various ministries, totaling around 50,000 individuals, marked for execution without trial. However, by 1944, the Allies reached a consensus to hold a trial instead. One significant concern among the Allies about an open court was that testimonies might reveal sensitive information, such as the Munich Agreement that led to their surrender of Czechoslovakia and the financial and technological support that American corporations provided to the Third Reich. Additionally, the existence of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact between the Soviet Union and Hitler prior to the war could come to light. Despite these worries, the Allies ultimately agreed that the Nuremberg trial would proceed as a legal, open process. A brief digression is warranted here. The Nuremberg trials represent the first instance of Allied nations being held accountable for war crimes. Following World War I, there was an attempt to bring German leaders to justice for the significant destruction of cultural heritage and the use of poison gas on battlefields, both considered war crimes. However, that effort led to a court run by the Germans themselves, who summoned about 900 military leaders, of whom 90% failed to appear, with many fleeing. Ultimately, the proceedings were largely ignored, resulting in no convictions. Thus, the Nuremberg trials stand as a crucial precedent for addressing such issues. On November 20, 1945, the Nuremberg trials commenced, aiming to prosecute war criminals through an international tribunal. The four primary charges included conspiracy to seize power in Germany, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Not only were individual perpetrators held accountable, but several organizations were also convicted, including the National Socialist Party of Germany, the SS, the Gestapo, the Wehrmacht, the German State Bank, and the German government. This encompassed all those responsible for decisions that led to extermination and those who issued the related criminal orders. France's participation was met with skepticism. A famous historical anecdote illustrates this. When Field Marshal Keitel signed Germany's surrender, it was acknowledged by 4 countries. Noticing the French removing a kid glove, he remarked, "So you won too, right?" This response reflected the fact that France had been occupied. However, the situation was more complicated as parts of France, particularly the Vichy government, collaborated fully with Nazi Germany. Thus, the media viewed France's presence at the tribunal with considerable skepticism. An understandable dynamic was at play, as a victim was needed to lend credibility to the proceedings, rather than just an arbitrator. Initially, it was anticipated that representatives from Yugoslavia would participate. However, the Western Allies preferred to exclude them due to the rising strength of the communist movement under Tito's leadership. It was evident that Yugoslavia would align more closely with the Stalinist camp, politically speaking, which led to their gentle exclusion from the trial. The French enjoyed considerable sympathy, largely due to General de Gaulle's popularity. The French accusers at the tribunal were all members of the resistance movement, which justified their presence. The court was structured with a British chair, Geoffrey Lawrence, U.S. prosecutor Robert Jackson, British attorney Hartley Shawcross, Soviet prosecutor Roman Rudenko, and French prosecutor François de Minton. The judges included Francis Biddle, Henri Dondieu, Jonah Nikitchenko, and Geoffrey Lawrence. Once the judges and prosecutors were appointed, the accused Germans were granted the right to a defense. However, they chose to decline the legal representation offered to them. Goering was the first to question the proceedings, pointing out the perceived one-sided nature of the trial. He stated, "How will you judge us? The defense will be yours." This prompted the search for German lawyers, but a significant obstacle arose. Many of these lawyers were unwilling to defend Nazi criminals, as they would have to live with the consequences. Consider the impact on a lawyer who has successfully defended a prominent industrialist or handled a notable family case. Being known as the one who defended Goering would certainly tarnish their reputation for the next 2 decades. Consequently, German lawyers declined to take on the defense, prompting the court to assure that those who participated would face no career repercussions after the trial. This acknowledgement highlighted their significant role in the proceedings. German lawyers eventually appeared at the trial as the accused sought representation through family connections. Some had their own lawyers, while others relied on friends and relatives to help find legal counsel. Regardless, all the accused managed to secure some form of defense. Who faced trial in the dock? The primary criminal, Hitler, evaded justice by committing suicide before Germany's surrender. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the RSHA and the mastermind behind the SS following Heydrich's death, was also absent. He bears direct responsibility for countless deaths in concentration camps, as well as for inhumane medical experiments and the appropriation of cultural property. Most notably, the term genocide was introduced at Nuremberg, marking the first occasion that the genocide of the Jewish people, commonly known as the Holocaust, along with the genocide of Polish and Soviet populations, was officially recognized. The Nuremberg trials set a precedent, leading to future tribunals for war criminals, including the Hague Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and a military tribunal for Rwanda, all stemming from the principles established in Nuremberg. This marked a pivotal moment for the development of international law. Hitler and Himmler were gone, and Joseph Goebbels, the chief propagandist, along with his wife and children, had taken their own lives. Martin Bormann, who was effectively the second in command of the National Socialist Party, vanished, as did Heinrich Müller, the head of the Gestapo. Although I will later discuss their fates, it's important to note that Müller was never located, while Bormann's remains were eventually identified. Ultimately, these individuals evaded justice. Following Germany's surrender, many criminals sought to escape using the so-called wolf trails. Some fled to Spain, where Francisco Franco's regime was sympathetic, while others went further to Portugal under Salazar, who also held favorable views toward Hitler. A few even made their way to Argentina, including figures like Dr. Mengele, who were located decades later. This indicates that despite extensive investigations, many individuals managed to evade accountability for their actions. At the trial, Hermann Goering was present as the highest-ranking defendant, holding titles such as Vice-Führer, Reichsmarschall, and Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe. Goering was the principal figure in the proceedings and the most significant criminal apprehended by the justice system. On October 30th, Rudolf Hess's defense sought to have him declared mentally ill. Despite an uncertain story during the war, he was Hitler's deputy within the Nazi Party and remained close to him throughout that time. Although captured by the English during the conflict, he still found himself at Nuremberg. Alongside him was Joachim von Ribbentrop, the Nazi regime's foreign minister, who was responsible for its entire foreign policy. Wilhelm Keitel served as Chief of Staff of the Wehrmacht High Command, a significant factor in the defense strategy of the German military. They contended, "What are you judging us for?" The war had commenced, and as military personnel, we were ordered to invade Poland and the Soviet Union. We were simply following orders. Evidence demonstrated their knowledge of the executions of civilians and the summary shootings that took place without trials. They issued these orders, and the destruction of numerous partisan villages largely involved the Wehrmacht. Alfred Rosenberg was a notably eccentric figure and regarded himself as the ideological architect of the Third Reich, which he largely was. Hans Frank served as the chief legal counsel for the regime and head of party legal affairs. Following Joseph Goebbels, he was significant in the realm of propaganda and enlightenment. The laws conceived by Frank's team in the 1930s and 1940s laid the groundwork for the Holocaust, facilitating the annihilation of individuals, establishment of concentration camps, trials, and appropriation of cultural property. His involvement in these actions will be thoroughly established. Julius Streicher stands out as one of the most deranged figures facing execution. He was the founder of the newspaper Stürmer, which served as a principal anti-Semitic propaganda organ in Hitler's Germany. I will provide further details about him later, but he too found himself in the dock. Walter Funk, serving as the General Commissioner for Military Economics, oversaw more than just industrial production for munitions. His role encompassed the exploitation of slave labor in factories and the forced transportation of people to Germany for work in military enterprises, among other atrocities. Karl Dönitz, who served as Grand Admiral and head of the German Navy for a decade, was responsible for naval operations during the war. Erich Raeder commanded the German submarine fleet. Any failures related to the lack of assistance for sailors from sunk ships would fall on him. Baldur von Schirach, another fervent figure, was the creator of the Hitlerjugend. Franz Sauckel served as the General Commissioner for Labor Utilization, overseeing the enslavement of prisoners of war and those forcibly removed from their homes, compelling them to work for the Third Reich. Alfred Jodl, as Chief of Staff for the Wehrmacht's operational leadership, was directly involved in formulating military strategies, from the invasion of Poland to the Barbarossa Plan targeting the Soviet Union. Franz von Papen, a diplomat who later received acquittal, played a significant role in facilitating Hitler and the Nazis' rise to power in Germany. Arthur Seyss-Inquart, another key party leader, was responsible for the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria, and for establishing a network of concentration camps in both Austria and the Netherlands. Albert Speer is often recognized as the chief architect of the Reich, known for his designs including the Olympic Stadium and plans for the reconstruction of Berlin. As Hitler's favorite architect, he oversaw not only monumental buildings and propaganda efforts, but also directed military factories. Furthermore, he was involved in utilizing prisoners of war and unlawfully detained individuals for labor in these military enterprises. Konstantin von Neurath, one of the most senior German diplomats, contributed to foreign policy prior to Ribbentrop. Lastly, Hans Fritzsche, whom I will detail later, served as the prominent voice of Hitler's Germany. He was known for his twice-weekly broadcasts on German radio, where he praised the valor of German troops and addressed the pressing issues surrounding Jews. Essentially, he was the individual who, through his fervent speeches twice a week, filled the hearts and minds of the German populace with rhetoric justifying the war. It's important to note that at that time, the internet did not exist. People relied solely on newspapers and radio for information. Goebbels, the Reich Minister of Propaganda, regarded radio as the primary medium for influencing the masses. If he had access to television at the time, it's uncertain how it would have altered the media landscape, as radio was already an effective tool for mass propaganda. Hans Fritzsche, who was closely connected to Goebbels, delivered broadcasts twice a week. There were widespread doubts about the proceedings due to uncertainties regarding how the Allies would collaborate, manage the process, and locate the necessary evidence for the accusations. Questions arose about how they would uncover the documents needed for prosecuting the criminals. As a graduate of the Historical and Archival Institute, I'd like to emphasize the significant role archivists played in this process. A vast amount of documents was discovered and utilized by the court, allowing for meticulous records of each victim and crime. We must acknowledge the Germans for this, as every detail was carefully documented, compiled into comprehensive reports, and submitted to the relevant ministries. For instance, a report noted that 10,000 people were executed in Ukraine. Truly shocking accounts exist from when the SS units of the Sonderkommando and Einsatzgruppen undertook actions against the civilian population, executing Jews and commissars. In their reports to Himmler in Berlin, they lamented about the hardships of their tasks, stating, "It's very hard to work, do you understand? We shoot 3,000 people a day. It's exhausting. We don't even take breaks for lunch." Here is a disturbing proposal presented in one of the reports. They suggested digging a grave with firing squads on either side. The idea was to shoot one group, allowing their bodies to fall into the grave, followed by another group, creating a layered burial. This approach was framed as a practical solution to streamline their work, eliminating the need for separate burials. This authentic document was sent to the RSX, where it received positive feedback and was approved as a practical proposal. Himmler signed off, and they proceeded with its implementation. Numerous such documents existed, including instructions on the proper use of gas vans, vehicles designed for gassing individuals. One particular manual specified the correct gas to use, warning that only Cyclone B should be employed, as other chemicals could clog the pipes. All of this was meticulously documented and while many records were concealed, hidden in mines or submerged in reservoirs, numerous documents ultimately surfaced, aiding in the pursuit of justice. Robert Jackson, the lead prosecutor for the American court, began his opening address with a stark warning. Our evidence will be horrifying, and you may find it disturbing. He emphasized that these actions caused a global shock, uniting all civilized individuals against Nazi Germany. Germany has turned into an immense torture chamber, with the cries of its victims echoing around the globe, causing distress among all civilized societies. While I have approached many accounts of horrific atrocities during this war with skepticism, the evidence introduced here will be so compelling that I confidently predict none of my statements will be challenged. The defendants may only dispute their individual culpability or their awareness of these crimes. This is not an exaggeration. Many people fainted after both the Soviet and American sides screened documentaries. Furthermore, the Germans on trial repeatedly stated, "We are merely shadows of Hitler. He was the one in charge, and we simply followed orders." Half of them will claim ignorance, asserting, "We didn't even know." This will be a common refrain among them. The only one who will put up any semblance of resistance during the trial is Goering, who will initially take center stage. However, let's trace the progression of the proceedings. The trial commenced on November 20th, 1945, generating considerable buzz. The first defendant is Robert Ley, who oversaw the German labor front, effectively managing all trade unions and the proletariat. He ultimately takes his own life without acknowledging any guilt. While he expresses sorrow over the horrific acts of anti-Semitism, he fundamentally remains supportive of Hitler. By 1945, Robert Ley had become a significant figure. He oversaw the entire labor movement, influencing all factories and the propagandistic posters associated with Hitler, which were primarily his creation. Unsurprisingly, he faced the death penalty, and by that year, he was in poor health and heavily reliant on alcohol. An incident in Robert Ley's life involved Edward Treath, who abdicated the British throne, leading to Elizabeth's reign. Edward, who stepped down due to his affair with an American actress, was sympathetic to the Reich and became a controversial figure in the history of the British monarchy. During a friendly visit to Germany, Ley personally drove Edward in a Mercedes. However, he was so intoxicated that he nearly caused a fatal accident. He was referred to as the Führer of the proletariat and was aware that execution awaited him. While the trial was not yet on the brink of failure, tensions started to arise among the various parties, the Soviets, Americans, and British, with the French being less involved. The trial required a cohesive script and an orchestrated flow, but misunderstandings began to emerge. On October 15th to 16, a significant event occurs as the prosecution calls for Gustav Krupp to be tried. Krupp, a key figure in Germany's steel industry, was instrumental in financing the Third Reich and played a crucial role in modernizing military factories at his own expense. He supported the economic foundation of Hitler's regime, yet by this time, he is an elderly man suffering from dementia. Eventually, attempts are made to substitute Gustav Krupp with his son, who also participated in the enterprise. However, the court remains divided on this matter. Consequently, Krupp faces charges but avoids trial due to his advanced age. On October 16th, the Kukriniks, renowned Soviet cartoonists, arrived to document the proceedings through their illustrations. The press was permitted to attend the trial, which was crucial because initially both the Americans and British proposed excluding journalists, fearing the unpredictable content of the proceedings. However, the Soviet Union opposed this, advocating for an open and adversarial process. Ultimately, journalists were allowed in, and filming took place in the courtroom. The upper galleries of the Nuremberg court were allocated for spectators, attracting not only the wives of the accused, but also many others eager to witness the proceedings. This raised a question for me. Why didn't the entire population of Nuremberg gather around the courthouse each day? The trial was a significant event that had captured worldwide attention. However, reading the memoirs of Soviet, American, and British military personnel from Germany and the Nuremberg area reveals a desolate landscape. German women scavenged for cigarette butts, which they gathered and sold. The country faced severe hunger and a lack of heating. In reality, Germany lay in ruins. As a result, the German people had little interest in attending the court as spectators. Even into the 1970s, German sentiments remained complex. While public opinion polls indicated that most viewed Hitler as a despicable criminal, there was still a sense of sympathy among some towards him. Ultimately, this trial represented the perspective of a defeated Germany. Ultimately, you will give us what you desire. The circumstances in Nuremberg were dire, with the city in ruins. However, the teams of members enjoyed accommodations in nearby mansions. The prosecution operated from a somewhat refurbished section of the Nuremberg court, which had also been restored to some extent. The primary gathering spot for the participants was undoubtedly the Grand Hotel. After meetings, journalists, NKVD officials, and intelligence officers from America and Great Britain would convene there to discuss events over cocktails. Many stories emerged from these interactions at the Grand Hotel, which served as a space for relaxation amidst the intense atmosphere surrounding the trial. The British expressed frustration over a lack of English beverages for their judicial teams, with many lords sending drinks at their own expense. Given the intense atmosphere, it's understandable that they yearned for a drink at the end of the day. The grim reality they faced was indeed overwhelming. On November 21st, when it was his turn to respond, Goering needed only to agree or disagree with the charges against him. Instead, the articulate speaker diverted the conversation by questioning the Allies' actions, asking, "What about the bombing of Dresden? And what about Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Shouldn't we discuss those as well?" His attempts to shift focus were swiftly cut off, as his captivating oratory and eloquence left others speechless. "Please answer directly. Do you agree or disagree with the charges?" After that, von Ribbentrop steps forward. When asked the same question, he responds, "We were all just shadows of Hitler." This sentiment encapsulated the core defense of the accused, portraying themselves as mere subordinates who lacked the ability to resist and had no opportunity to make a difference. Julius Streicher, a key figure in promoting anti-Semitism and the creator of Der Stürmer, declared, "This trial serves as a platform for international jury. I see that many of the judges and prosecutors are Jews, and I do not anticipate a fair trial for myself." Subsequently, the delusional old man was returned to the dock. The following day, Streicher attempted to assert his insanity through his lawyer. Undoubtedly a peculiar character, he embodied madness. However, the court dismissed his plea, deeming him sane. Around the same time, an astonishing discovery took place in Munich. 9 million NSDAP membership cards were nearly discarded. Essentially, the entire archive had been on the verge of being thrown away until it was unexpectedly recovered. I must emphasize the work of the archivists, as it's worth repeating. They operate under incredibly challenging conditions, with 700 individuals examining vast amounts of documents. Can you grasp the scale of this? Each day, these archivists meticulously sift through tons of paperwork and connect it to the relevant cases. In the latter half of November, the Nuremberg trials focus on the early actions of the Nazis, particularly the Anschluss of Austria, which involved the forceful annexation and integration of Austria into Germany, along with the establishment of concentration camps. During this time, Bach-Zelewski is being questioned while Goering addresses the court. During the proceedings, a sense of humor emerges when Goering recounts how the Austrians conceded, negotiated for positions in the future government, and how some rushed to join the NSDAP. This leads to laughter among journalists in the hall, as references arise from the archives regarding reports and notes related to Seyss-Inquart, who was seen as rather inept, prompting Goering's responses. The atmosphere in the hall is quite lively, with people chuckling at the absurdity. It's a glimpse into the inner workings of the Nazis. Just think of how many foolish individuals were involved. The session concludes on November 29th, when the Americans present a film depicting the concentration camps. At this point, the mood shifts dramatically and laughter fades away. Graphic images of emaciated corpses, crematoriums, gas chambers, murdered children, and mothers who perished alongside their kids in the gas chambers of Dachau, Buchenwald, and Majdanek are displayed. Clearly, this becomes a profoundly serious matter. The Soviet Union announces it is in the process of creating its own film, which will be thoroughly detailed and completed promptly. Scheduled for release next year, it will be shown on February 19th and is expected to have a powerful impact. The film will vividly depict horrifying content, such as how soap was manufactured from human remains and human skin being used to cover report folders. These gruesome details significantly alter our perception of the statistics. For instance, while stating that 1,000 people died presents a chilling figure, learning that their skin was turned into bindings or lampshades brings an entirely different level of horror. This disturbing content will be featured prominently by the Soviet side. A brief note on Hess. He is a significant figure within the Reich, having been one of Hitler's close associates and friends. As a prominent leader of the National Socialist Party of Germany, he was also seen as a fiercely loyal supporter of Hitler. At the onset of the war with the Soviet Union, Hess, who had recently trained as a pilot, boards a plane and flies to England, where he is seen as the second highest-ranking member in the party and possibly the third in the Reich. Upon arrival, he engages in discussions with British aristocrats, seeking to persuade them to form an alliance with Hitler's Germany against the Bolsheviks. However, he is apprehended in England and imprisoned. Initially, Hess claims that Hitler sent him for these negotiations, but later contends It was his own initiative. In Germany, a concerted media campaign emerges claiming that Hess has gone mad after flying to England, leading to his name being erased from various platforms. He remains imprisoned in England throughout the war and is later brought to the Nuremberg trials. Initially, it might appear that he could claim ignorance, saying, "I flew to England, I know nothing." However, he faces serious charges under the first article pertaining to the seizure of power in Germany, the Nazi plan. Just a few days later, a forensic examination concludes that Hess is sane. During the trial, Hess displays unusual behavior. He suffers from complete amnesia and does not recognize anyone, which is genuinely perplexing and appears genuine rather than an act. Clearly, he is in a peculiar mental state. While still in England, he begins to experience headaches from a lack of food and believes he has been poisoned. He insists, "I'm not dying because I'm accustomed to the poison. Every day the jailers put poison in my food, but here I am, alive. My body has adapted." Clearly, he was unhinged. It's quite astonishing, isn't it? Most of those who weren't executed, including many high-ranking military and civilian officials from Hitler's Germany, would go on to live long lives. Only in 1983, 1987, 1992, and 2000 did they begin to pass away. Hess also lived for many years. He was sentenced to life imprisonment and ultimately died in Spandau prison, where he was generally regarded as sane. In early December 1945, a significant event occurs that alters the trial proceedings. Goering gives an extensive interview to Neue Zeitung, which is later reprinted by the New York Times. Following this, the press is prohibited from communicating with the defendants. While communication continues through lawyers sharing documents and notes with the outside world, no further interviews are permitted. The prosecution, particularly the Soviet Union, recognizes the problem and argues, why allow Goering to turn the trial into a platform for self-promotion? Goering clearly captivates his audience, exhibiting charisma and influence over those seated with him in the dock. Afterward, Goering will be housed separately, where he has meals in his cell, manipulating the other prisoners. They use mealtime to discuss their defense strategies and related matters. Following this interview, communication with the press will be strictly prohibited. On December 8th, an unusual event occurs when a Red Army soldier named Buben is shot outside the Grand Hotel, where he was waiting in his car for his boss. According to various accounts, the assailant approached him dressed either in civilian clothes or an American uniform. Some identified him as a former Nazi. Buben was struck in the head, and while he seemed like an innocent bystander, it turns out he was waiting for Mikhail Likhachov, an NKVD officer who had been part of the Special Committee of the MGB since 1946. Initial theories suggest that the intended target was Likhachov, not Buben. The prevailing theory at the time was that the Germans had orchestrated a provocation aimed at sowing discord among the trial participants. Concurrently, Soviet pilots were detained after landing in Nuremberg without clearance. The circumstances surrounding this were unclear, with some claiming weather conditions prevented official permission, while American witnesses in the occupation zone stated they hadn't been notified. Rudenko, who was leading the Soviet charges, protested the arrests, and ultimately, the pilots were released. I mention this because the environment was not conducive to dialogue, even though many claimed that the working relationship among the Americans, Russians, and British was satisfactory. Nonetheless, underlying tensions undeniably complicated matters. On December 11th, a documentary titled The Nazi Plan was screened, based on actual German military footage. The film illustrated how these actions were not random. It revealed that the Germans had a deliberate strategy to conquer Europe and exterminate the population, particularly targeting Slavic people. During this time, horrifying evidence from the Buchenwald concentration camp is presented to the court, including lampshades crafted from human skin, some adorned with tattoos. Additionally, a paperweight in the shape of a dried head of an executed prisoner was found on the desk of the camp's commander, Koch. Trials are not limited to Nuremberg. In the occupation zones, 36 guards from Dachau have been sentenced to death and executed. An associated story involves Koch's wife, who received a life sentence and died in 1967. Although she was at home cooking, she was complicit in the torture of prisoners and requested lampshades made from human skin, specifically asking for those adorned with tattoos, saying, "I prefer the ones with tattoos. Why are you bringing me plain ones? Look for ones with tattoos." Survivors of Dachau described the torture as particularly cruel. It was evident that Buchenwald was operated by individuals with severe psychological issues who exerted unchecked power over defenseless prisoners. Koch would face his own trial later, along with a separate process for his wife, Elsa Koch. It's important to note that while we often focus on the Nuremberg trials, there were also several smaller trials held in the American occupation zone, around a dozen in total. These included proceedings against the leaders of the Sonderkommando and Einsatzgruppen, as well as trials for guards, doctors, and German judges. Both American and Soviet authorities aimed to bring as many individuals as possible to justice, recognizing that mere figures like Hitler could not have orchestrated the extensive and horrific abuses alone. Many more officials were likely complicit in these crimes than are typically acknowledged. By the end of December, the court begins to hold organizations accountable, not just the main perpetrators. Accusations are directed at the SS, SA, Gestapo, NSDAP, and the German government. Additionally, Martin Bormann is included as an absent defendant. He was a prominent and influential figure, second in command within Hitler's party, but vanished during the chaos of the Berlin assault. Last seen attempting to flee from Soviet forces while clinging to a tank's armor, he was caught in an explosion that disabled the tank. After that incident, he disappeared, having fled to a nearby railway bridge. The authorities will later discover a body in the uniform of a high-ranking Nazi officer, believed to belong to Martin Bormann, but it ultimately remains unidentified. Subsequently, this body goes missing and is only rediscovered decades later during renovation work in Berlin, where 2 bodies are uncovered. Another individual implicated in absentia is Müller, the former head of the Gestapo, famously portrayed by Bronovoy in 17 Moments of Spring. He held personal responsibility for numerous acts of torture, deportations, and murders. Although there are reports of his sighting in Argentina years later, these remain unsubstantiated rumors. Ultimately, Müller is never found. The court then takes a break, with proceedings set to resume in January. On January 3rd, a significant media sensation erupts due to Otto Ohlendorf's testimony regarding the Einsatzgruppe responsible for mass executions in the Soviet Union. For the first time, a document detailing the atrocities committed in regions like Belarus and Ukraine under Nazi occupation is presented. It reveals chilling accounts of how partisans were shot, tortured, and subjected to brutal treatment, including mass executions. This information is made available to the public for the first time, causing widespread horror as it exposes a dark chapter of history that had never been seen before. The media landscape is evolving significantly, featuring major newspapers, photographic films, and newsreels. Many Germans who participated weren't merely fanatics or cruel, they were also naive. They would record evidence of their crimes on film, intending to later showcase it to friends and family at home, boasting about their actions. Such documents ultimately found their way into the prosecution's files. On January 8th, a significant development occurs with the inclusion of Hitler's book Mein Kampf as evidence of crimes in the case. This becomes a crucial moment, marking the beginning of a comprehensive ban on all symbols, cultural aspects, and propaganda associated with the Third Reich and any items linked to Nazi Germany's activities. On January 14th, during 2 days of interrogation and evidence presentation, the court reviews testimonies from Dönitz and Raeder. Dönitz oversaw the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, while Raeder commanded the submarine fleet. Raeder faces 2 significant accusations. One is his order prohibiting rescues of individuals in the water after attacks by German submarines. The directive stated, "If you sink an enemy merchant ship or warship, do not surface to assist those stranded. Prioritize your vessel and leave the area." This order has been criticized as reflecting inhumane warfare practices. On January 17th, the French prosecutor de Menton addresses the court, highlighting the extensive pillaging of France and the illegal exportation of cultural treasures. He specifically notes that approximately 1 million bottles of champagne were taken. There was indeed a specific individual appointed by the Nazi regime responsible for overseeing alcohol in Hitler's Germany. As a former wine merchant, I recall that this official oversaw the inspection of cellars and managed the export of fine wines, such as Bordeaux, Burgundy, and Champagne, into the Third Reich. On January 19th, a significant development emerges with the indictment of Fritz Sauckel, whom I mentioned earlier. As the General Commissioner for the Use of Labor, Sauckel initially appears unbothered by the court proceedings, considering his background as an engineer overseeing the workforce. However, damning documents bearing his signature are presented, highlighting the utilization of slave labor and directives emphasizing cost-cutting to boost economic efficiency. In his defense, he claims that they did provide some payment. Yes, they received a few Reichsmarks a day, he argues, yet acknowledges that not everyone benefited. These directives advocating for maximizing slave labor are also introduced as evidence in court. Ultimately, the case of an individual tasked with engineering and labor management becomes crucial evidence against one of the principal criminals, as it reveals his full awareness and endorsement of the actions taken, including punishing subordinates for inadequate utilization of slave labor. On January 30th, Rudolf Hess takes the stand. Prior to this, He spent the proceedings appearing detached and unresponsive. However, on this day, he unexpectedly asserts his desire to defend himself without a lawyer, claiming dissatisfaction with their performance. This marks a surprising shift in Hess's demeanor. During this period, the prosecution presents evidence against Albert Speer, the chief architect of the Reich. Speer's rise to prominence is noteworthy. He was indeed a gifted architect and muralist, responsible for the Roman-inspired architecture of the Third Reich, including the iconic Olympic Stadium in Berlin, which he oversaw. His ascent began in 1937 during an international exhibition featuring pavilions for both Hitler's Germany and the Soviet Union. The Germans learned that the Soviets were constructing a massive statue titled Worker and Collective Farmer, which famously crowns their pavilion. It's designed to symbolize the worker and collective farmer looming over the German pavilion, almost as if they're about to crush it. Speer then redesigns the German pavilion to stand as a stronghold, a solid bastion opposing the Soviet Union, topped by an eagle clutching a swastika. In his defense, Speer argues that all Germans fell victim to the dictatorship of the industrial state. He claims that the 80 million members of the German population were powerless against the overwhelming propaganda infiltrating every aspect of life, from radio broadcasts and newspapers to pre-movie promotions and daily military reviews, leading them to succumb to this insidious influence. This is his attempt at justification. On February 8th, a significant event unfolds as Rudenko, the chief prosecutor representing the Soviet Union, delivers a powerful accusatory speech that has an explosive impact. He establishes himself as an exceptional accuser, effectively challenging Goering, who had been relentless in his mockery and banter throughout the proceedings. During Goering's interrogation, Rudenko skillfully puts him in his place on multiple occasions. After this trial, Rudenko gains remarkable recognition in the Soviet Union and eventually becomes the prosecutor general. In the 1960s, even Khrushchev questions him, asking, "Do you think, Comrade Rudenko, that your position is permanent? Will you always be the prosecutor general?" However, Rudenko's legacy endures. He serves in this role until his death in 1981. The Nuremberg trial serves as a protective barrier for Rudenko, shielding him from the deadly purges that followed Stalin's death. He navigates through Khrushchev's era and remains in his position until he passes away during Brezhnev's tenure, consistently serving as the general prosecutor. Rudenko asserts that the claims from the German military staff and witnesses, which allege that there were no plans for the invasion or the extermination of the Slavic population prior to the Soviet invasion, are outright falsehoods. He highlights the testimony of Field Marshal Paulus, who was captured during the Battle of Stalingrad, and states that he is prepared to submit this evidence to the court. Despite Rudenko's claim about having a living witness in Paulus, skepticism runs high. Many believe he is dead or perished in Soviet camps. Several articles have emerged questioning Paulus's existence. The defense attorneys challenge Rudenko, asking, "If he's alive, why are you presenting documents signed by him? How can we verify the signature?" With a hint of mockery, they ask Rudenko, "Is he really alive?" To which he confidently responds, "Yes, of course." They then press for when he can present him in court, to which Rudenko reportedly replies, "In 27 minutes." In reality, Paulus indeed did not appear in Nuremberg just 27 minutes later. Instead, he was flown in from Moscow a few days later. This unexpected arrival is effectively depicted in the film Nuremberg. When Paulus finally testifies, he provides detailed accounts, stating, "Yes, the Barbarossa plan was orchestrated by Hitler. Goering and the entire top brass of the Wehrmacht were involved in its preparation, along with intelligence, the SS, the Gestapo, and the Reich Ministry of Finance. Everyone was aware of it. We planned for the extermination of the Slavic population and aimed to expand our Lebensraum. Yes, we were preparing the Barbarossa plan, and here is the evidence to prove it." Paulus's testimony ultimately led to the sentencing of Keitel and Jodl to the gallows, marking a significant turning point in the Nuremberg trials. Goering, who previously joked about the situation, telling Ribbentrop he would still be the Reich minister in the new Germany, now realizes the serious implications of the trial and its potential to condemn all the accused. Facing this grim reality, he begins to exert influence over the other defendants. At this point, an order is given to isolate Goering in the dining room, ensuring he eats in his cell to prevent him from influencing the other defendants. On February 19th, the Soviet accusers deliver another devastating blow, intensifying their case by showing a Soviet film depicting Nazi atrocities committed in the Soviet Union. The horror is conveyed through the lens of bureaucratic practices. Initially, soap made from the fat and bones of prisoners is presented in the hall, along with human skin used for bindings and lampshades. Documents are displayed to reveal the origins of the gruesome idea to produce soap from corpses. This was not merely symbolic. The Germans embraced various formats and scents. They approached population extermination methodically, reasoning, "We can make soap from them. Why let these lives go to waste? They're dead already. We might as well utilize their skin." Forgive my cynicism, but this represents a method of waste-free production. For the first time at Nuremberg, a system for the ruthless extermination of people was unveiled, highlighting how, even after death, victims were exploited. Some bodies were turned into soap, while others were used for medical experiments. As the camps transformed into massive laboratories, the trials revealed recorded atrocities, including freezing children and women, or injecting individuals with plague and other diseases. The Germans meticulously documented these horrific practices, and this evidence was presented for the first time during the trial. The true magnitude of the crimes is being presented on the international stage for the first time. In March, a potentially destabilizing event occurs. Winston Churchill, the former Prime Minister of Great Britain, delivers his notable speech in Fulton. In this address, he acknowledges Stalin as a valuable ally and refers to Soviet soldiers as friends, but warns that the Soviet Union is expanding into Europe, absorbing countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria into its sphere of influence. He suggests that this expansion could lead to a vast red belt. Churchill's speech deepens the divisions between the opposing sides involved in the trial. Once again, Goering comments, alongside Ribbentrop, on the impending collapse of the trial, suggesting they have another opportunity to sway events. On March 11th, nearing the end of proceedings, U.S. Chief Prosecutor Jackson and Soviet Chief Prosecutor Rudenko decide to avoid certain topics. The Americans are wary of discussing the Third Reich's financing, while the Soviets refuse to address issues such as the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact and the Katyn shootings of Polish officers. The Soviet Union claims that the Poles were executed by the Germans, but the Germans provide documents indicating that these executions occurred before 1941, suggesting that Soviet officers were responsible. Eventually, in the 1990s and 2000s, Russian authorities would acknowledge that the NKVD carried out the Katyn executions. However, this information was not known at the time, leading to a decision to avoid addressing the topic. The interrogation of Goering commences with Milch defending him. Milch, an interesting figure, serves as the head of the Luftwaffe, while Goering is the founder of Germany's Air Force and holds the title of Vice Führer. Milch is responsible for its operational directing. A well-known phrase highlights that Jews, and those with even partial Jewish descent, were barred from holding significant positions in Germany. Milch, who was half Jewish, served as Goering's deputy. Initially involved in civil aviation, he played a key role in establishing Germany's civil aviation sector. When Goering sought expertise, he brought Milch on board. Milch eventually expressed his frustration to Goering, stating, "What kind of Luftwaffe am I? I have part of my family heritage as Jewish. My father was a Jew." Subsequently, they tampered with the documents, pressuring Milch's mother to submit a humiliating statement claiming that he was not fathered by her husband, but by a German aristocrat. This was necessary because the aristocrat was already married. As a result, forged documents were created. Goering remarked jokingly, "Indeed, Milch was treated like cattle, but at least he got an aristocrat for a father, a respectable choice." An incredible incident occurred when Streicher, the publisher of the newspaper Der Stürmer, became utterly unhinged. He began searching for Jews everywhere and came across the story of Milch. In a letter to Hitler, he lamented, "We are building an Aryan state, destroying and expelling Jews, yet Goering has a Jew as his deputy." As the proceedings commenced, it is rumored that Goering responded to Hitler, asserting, "I determine who is Jewish within my Luftwaffe." Consequently, Milch remained in his position. However, this isn't the conclusion of the tale. By 1944, as the war was nearing its end, Streicher and Goering engaged in a devastating internal conflict. This intra-party struggle reveals how, despite the appearance of the Third Reich's unified strength, chaos reigned among its leaders, much like spiders in a jar devouring each other daily. This topic warrants discussion on its own. In 1944, Streicher raised the Milch case once again, but it did not advance. In his newspaper Der Stürmer, he went on to accuse Goering of fathering a child with his second wife despite being wounded in the groin during the beer hall putsch. He claimed that due to this injury and subsequent medication, it was implausible for Goering to conceive a child naturally, suggesting instead that the child was conceived in vitro, which he asserted was fundamentally un-Aryan. This accusation was prominently featured in Der Stürmer. Goering was understandably appalled when a trial concerning his financial dealings commenced against Streicher. Questions arose about Streicher's activities regarding propaganda and anti-Semitism, specifically whether he profited from them. It emerged that he had not maintained offshore accounts, likely due to their absence at the time, but that he did have Swiss accounts and had engaged in the illegal expropriation of valuables and art collections from Jews, much like Goering himself. Ultimately, this incident led to Streicher's downfall in his career. Milch found himself in the American occupation zone, where he was rumored to have fended off American soldiers with his marshal's baton. He attended court to defend Goering, asserting, "I am a Jew, and you cannot hold Goering accountable for the Holocaust. He protected Jews, including me." Interestingly, the Americans would later return Milch's marshal's baton after a span of 20 years. On April 15th, a witness named Hess was interrogated in Nuremberg. He described the horrific conditions, detailing gas chambers and crematoria used for the systematic extermination of people. His testimony would later play a significant role in the trial against IG Farben Industry, the company that manufactured the poisonous Cyclone B gas used in extermination camps. Many recognizable brands like Bayer, which produces aspirin, as well as BASF and AGFA, were part of this large German conglomerate, IG Farben. This reflects the operation of a killing machine, as German firms were tasked with developing such methods. Hess noted the need for a systematic approach to the murders. They proposed conducting medical examinations, where prisoners would stand against a wall and a shooter would execute them through a hole in the wall, allowing for the potential slaughter of dozens a day. However, this method proved cumbersome, necessitating a more efficient tool for mass killings. Thus, gas started to be introduced as the solution. Another indication of the brutal treatment of people as expendable resources is the directive to eliminate a large number of individuals, which the industry complied with. In March, events unfolded that, while not directly related to Nuremberg, were still significant in the context of Germany. This involved the suicide of Karl Haushofer, Rudolf Hess's former teacher, who initially articulated the underpinnings of Hitler's ideology. He justified seizing territories and exterminating the Slavic population by deeming them subhumans, contrasting them with Aryans, whom he regarded as superior. Another fundamental concept was the expansion of living space. The Reich was intended to grow to the Urals. Shortly after this, he committed suicide. At the same time, Goering's interrogation began, lasting approximately 10 days. During these sessions, Rudenko confronted Goering with evidence, emphasizing that he was undoubtedly aware of racial cleansing, concentration camps, and the systematic expropriation of valuables. Goering indeed possessed a significant art collection, acquired through clear means from looted territories. Tatiana Stupnikova, a simultaneous interpreter, recounts an incident where she arrived late for a court session and stumbled. Someone helped her up, saying, "Madam, be careful, don't fall. You are in good hands." To her surprise, it was Goering being courteous. While interpreters had existed before the Nuremberg trials, they played a crucial role during these proceedings due to the language barrier between Germans who lacked proficiency in English and Americans who didn't speak German. Translating accusations, defense statements, and testimonies meant that interpreters carried significant responsibility. Translating in this setting was incredibly demanding, requiring simultaneous interpreters to render everything word for word in real time. Unlike an audiobook, where pacing can be controlled, the courtroom's dynamics changed rapidly. When the defense presented a point, immediate rebuttals arose that needed instant translation. Thus, the contribution of simultaneous interpreters was immensely valuable. On April 3rd, a significant moment occurred when the prosecution introduced documents later known as the Diary of Anne Frank. Anne, a Jewish girl in Holland, documented the atrocities of German occupation, which became crucial evidence. Then, on April 15th, Rosenberg, a philosopher and key ideologist of the Reich, delivered a speech. However, his address came across as nonsensical, rooted in mysticism rather than substantive argument, focusing on an imagined destiny for Aryans to oppose Slavs and referencing runes, Vikings, and Tibet. Their mindset, indicative of a broader belief in their ideology, which I will explore further in a later program about Annenierbe, was quite extreme. They viewed their conflict not merely as a war against Bolshevism, but as a crusade. Alongside the struggle against Bolsheviks, they believed it was essential to combat Jews, whom they accused of monopolizing power and control. Additionally, they regarded the Catholic Church as an adversary to Nazism, for drawing followers away from their cause, which led to persecution against the Church as well. During his hour-and-a-half speech, Rosenberg delivered nonsensical ideas, prompting Goering to comment to someone, "What an idiot he is! How did Hitler even associate with him?" This reflected the harsh reality of the situation. On April 29th, Julius Streicher, notorious for publishing the anti-Semitic newspaper Der Stürmer, was interrogated. He was so despised that even fellow Nazis preferred not to sit near him and placed him some distance away. He was indeed an alcoholic, a drug addict, and importantly, there were strong indications that he may have been a pedophile. This was his second appearance in the Nuremberg building. The first occurred before the war when he faced charges of lewd acts involving minors, but he was acquitted at that time. Nonetheless, it was widely believed, though not openly acknowledged, that he habitually exploited underage girls. Numerous scandals had arisen, some skillfully suppressed while others were less effectively concealed. Streicher was widely regarded as a ghoul and an idiot who had become unhinged over the issue of Jews. At one point, he even claimed that Himmler, the head of the SS, exhibited Negroid features, indicating his complete insanity. When faced with accusations, Streicher dismissed the proceedings, asserting they weren't a serious court session, but rather a Purim celebration. He would shout, "Purim Fest," as they prepared to execute him. By then, he was an elderly man, and everyone had grown weary of his nonsensical remarks after hours of them. In May, the interrogation of Walter Funk, the Commissioner General for the Military Economy, commenced. He believed he would not face any consequences due to his financial responsibilities. As accusations arose, intriguing documents surfaced, revealing numerous accounts at the Reichsbank and other German banks opened under the name Max Heiliger. However, no such individual existed. These accounts were linked to funds obtained from the sale of Jewish property and seized Jewish assets. Funk started to refute the allegations, claiming that the accounts were related to Himmler and the SS. However, documents revealed that he and Himmler had agreed to consolidate all confiscated Jewish assets into the account under the name Max Heiliger, for administrative convenience. This clearly indicated that Funk, an ordinary individual responsible for overseeing the finances, was directly implicated in the ongoing expropriation of assets during the Holocaust. In May, a significant document surfaced marking the Nuremberg court's decision to prohibit Nazi culture. This culture, characterized by its appealing elements, like the uniforms designed by Hugo Boss, fascist salutations, torchlit parades, propaganda eagles, and swastikas, had undeniably captivated many. Even today, neo-Nazi movements continued to thrive in numerous countries. In Nuremberg, a document was issued that fully prohibited Nazi culture. Meanwhile, parallel proceedings were occurring in the occupation zones, including Great Britain and the United States. In May, 49 staff members from the notorious Mauthausen concentration camp were executed. On May 17th, Romanian dictator Antonescu was also executed. He expressed no remorse and maintained his loyalty to Hitler, insisting that his actions were justified. In Prague, Hans Frank, known for his role as the executioner of Czechoslovakia, was executed. On May 22nd, a peculiar incident occurred involving Zariah, a prosecutor from the Soviet Union. A skilled and dedicated professional, he accidentally shot himself in the head while cleaning his gun, resulting in his death, which was ruled a suicide. This incident was kept quiet, but in the late 80s, his daughter, or possibly his granddaughter, uncovered documents in the archives revealing discrepancies. The bullet was different from the gun, and the presence of numerous blood traces on the bed suggested it was not a suicide, but a murder. The question arose, who could have killed him and why? Indications suggest he possessed a cipher from Moscow, along with documents from Molotov and Wyszynski, all personally approved by Stalin. These documents explicitly stated that two items must not surface at Nuremberg: the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, which outlined the division of pre-war influence between Germany and the Soviet Union. This would later be referenced to argue that Germany did not initiate the war alone, implying they were practically allies with the Soviet Union. The second issue was the Katyn execution, which was to be excluded from the trial proceedings. The Allies had come to this agreement, and during interrogations, Zariah questioned Ribbentrop, the German foreign minister. Ribbentrop dismissed the accusations at the trial, even reciting the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact from memory. Subsequently, Zariah was blamed for failing to control Ribbentrop and was executed, a widely accepted version of events. The Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact requires a comprehensive analysis, as it is a complex document that helps to explain why Stalin chose to sign it. He was aware that preparations for war were underway and anticipated a German attack, though there appeared to be some hesitance on his part. Various interpretations exist regarding this, but despite expectations that it would remain unspoken during the trial, it was addressed. On May 24th, a significant interrogation took place involving Baldur von Schirach, the Reich youth leader who oversaw all German youth initiatives and was the architect of the Hitler Youth. He provided extensive evidence detailing the organization of propaganda and how children were indoctrinated into Hitler's ideologies through political education and youth marches accompanied by drums and Nazi banners. This use of symbols, including the swastika, was thoroughly documented and presented by the prosecutors during the trial. June 28th marks a significant moment in identifying those responsible for the crimes, not just military personnel and those in the Ministry of Internal Affairs, SS, SA, or SD, but also media figures and propagandists. Notably, Goebbels and his family took their own lives. On this day in 1946, Fritzsche faced interrogation by Soviet prosecutor Rudenko. Fritzsche had served as the voice of Goebbels, broadcasting poisonous propaganda to the German public multiple times a week. A memorable quote from renowned American author Hemingway states, "Fascism is a lie uttered by bandits." As I diligently prepare a historical summary in my notebook, something I enjoy, I reflected on the fates of German propagandists and media leaders. Hans Fritzsche, the voice of the Third Reich, comes to mind. While Goebbels was the most famous propagandist, without him, Fritzsche remains significant. Yet he evaded execution, raising questions about what happened to others involved. Announcer Harry Giese passed away in 1991 without facing any legal repercussions. He enjoyed a successful career as a voiceover artist in reunited Germany and continued to work there unimpeded. Angry was one of Germany's propaganda newspapers. Julius Lippert passed away from natural causes in 1956 after serving a 2-year sentence and being released. A massive network was necessary for disseminating materials like Mein Kampf, along with the Das Reich newspaper and the Völkischer Beobachter, Germany's principal publication under Goebbels' direction. This media ecosystem was managed by a significant organization known as Franz R. Verlag, which functioned as a state enterprise overseeing all media operations. He oversaw all media operations in the publication of newspapers, as this was central to the agenda. Max Amann, president of the Imperial Press Chamber, passed away in 1957, while Otto Dietrich, the Imperial Press Chief, died in 1952. Alfred Hugenberg, part of the media consortium that printed much of the German press, also died from natural causes in 1951. Gunther Dalquin, editor of the SS newspaper The Black Corps, lived until 1998 without facing any consequences for his actions. Werner Naumann, State Secretary of the Imperial Ministry of Public Education and Propaganda, oversaw textbooks, newspapers, and children's education. He passed away from natural causes in 1982. As previously mentioned, Völkischer Beobachter was Germany's leading newspaper. Its editor-in-chief, Wilhelm Weiss, received a 3-year sentence and died in the 1950s. These figures represent key players in German propaganda who managed to evade significant punishment or served relatively short sentences before their release. There was also a significant cultural component to propaganda, epitomized by the renowned director Leni Riefenstahl. She created several foundational propaganda films for the Third Reich, the most famous being The Triumph of the Will, which depicted the National Socialist Party's rally in Nuremberg with its impressive torchlight processions and stunning crane shots that gave it a grand, monumental feel. Another notable film is Olympia, centered around the Berlin Olympics, showcasing the human form in an almost ethereal manner through impressive aerial shots from cranes, as drones were not available at the time. Both films demonstrate Riefenstahl's extraordinary ability to craft visually captivating narratives. What were the outcomes of the Nuremberg trials? Leni Riefenstahl lived a remarkable life. After the war, she became a photographer and published an impressive photo album titled Africa, showcasing its people. She also developed a passion for underwater photography and passed away in 2003. Despite facing accusations of complicity and being labeled as a sympathizer of the Nazis after the war, she never faced any consequences or punishment for her past. There were even more disturbing examples, such as the film Jews of Zeus, commissioned by Goebbels in response to his demand for anti-Jewish propaganda. Directed by Harlan, this film is a harrowing display of anti-Semitic content. The director led a life in Germany before ultimately shooting the film and passing away at the age of 64 on the picturesque island of Capri in Italy, where he sought treatment for a lung condition. Karl Ritter, a name unknown to many, was responsible for producing films like The Jews of Susa, as well as various propaganda short films and feature-length works. He carried on with his production work even after the Nuremberg trials and passed away contentedly in 1977. This discussion pertains to the media's accountability, which faced appropriate consequences. An important point to note is that amnesty was quite extensive. For instance, Field Marshal Manstein, a notable German strategist recognized for his success in the Crimean operation, which led to the establishment of the Crimean Shield Award by the Third Reich, was put on trial. He faced accusations of ruthlessly exterminating partisans in Crimea. However, there was scant evidence to support these claims. Many soldiers regarded him as a compassionate and fair leader, not a cruel figure. He was truly one of them. Afterward, he continued his career in the Bundeswehr. This raises the question of how so many former military members began to re-emerge under amnesty in the mid-1950s. The answer is straightforward. The onset of the Cold War prompted these developments. In this context, both the Soviet camp and the North Atlantic Alliance, including the United States and NATO allies, observed the expansion of the Soviet Union. Notably, skilled propagandists and military officers became increasingly valuable, prompting their release. They received amnesty and shortened sentences, subsequently integrating into West Germany's military, financial, and economic systems. The Krupp family, consisting of a father, son, and several brothers, excelled in creating successful industrial enterprises due to their exceptional skills as merchants. The second point focuses on Wernher von Braun, known for developing the V-2 rocket, a weapon used to strike London from France. This marked the creation of the first operational combat missile by the Germans. During that period, German technology was advanced, producing some of the most modern tanks, artillery, and aircraft. Wernher von Braun did not issue any orders or participate directly in exterminations, but he designed weapons, and his factories utilized inhumane labor from concentration camp prisoners. It's difficult to believe he was unaware of these conditions. It's likely he was fully aware of what was happening. What happened to him? Initially, he seemed to vanish, but later reappeared in the United States. He then became instrumental in developing the American space industry, bringing along his engineers and designs that Soviet officers had not captured. He continued his work, contributing significantly to the United States. In America, he faced trials amid media scrutiny, with journalists questioning how a man labeled a fascist could work there. However, these concerns were largely downplayed due to his brilliance. This does not imply that some engineers and designs, as well as skilled labor, did not eventually surface in the Soviet Union, where they were also utilized. Unfortunately, politics can be a deeply troubled and unpleasant arena. In the face of conflict between opposing factions, however, any tactic may be deemed acceptable. Throughout the summer, the prosecution and defense have delivered their arguments. The accused are now permitted to give their final statements, during which some attempt to feign insanity and request examinations, though these pleas are denied. As the announcement of the verdict begins, it's evident that press interest in the trial is waning. Nonetheless, this moment marks the climax of the proceedings. One of the key moments is the final address by the Soviet prosecutor Rudenko, which garners significant media attention and becomes a classic example of accusations in international trials. The tribunal delivers its verdict between September 30th and October 1st, 1946. The following figures from Hitler's Germany were sentenced to death by hanging: Hermann Goering, Vice Führer and Reich Minister of Aviation, the second most powerful man in the Reich, and Martin Bormann, judged in absentia, who led the NSDAP party chancellery and held the title of Reichsführer. It's worth noting that this title was personally bestowed by Hitler and was not tied to an official position, but rather to one's closeness to him. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, head of the RSHA, notably served as president of Interpol for several years. The following individuals were sentenced to death: Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop, Wilhelm Keitel, Alfred Rosenberg, Hans Frank, and Reichsleiter Wilhelm Frick. Additionally, Julius Streicher, notorious for his extremist views, also faced execution. Fritz Sauckel, the labor commissioner, and Arthur Seyss-Inquart, who played a key role in the Anschluss of Austria, received the death penalty as well. Alfred Jodl, who headed operational leadership in the Wehrmacht, was likewise sentenced to death. Life sentences were imposed on Rudolf Hess, Deputy Führer, who would spend his final years in Spandau, dying in the 1980s. Walter Funk, president of the Reichsbank, and Erich Raeder, head of the submarine fleet, received similar sentences, but saw their terms reduced and were released in the 1960s. There would be persistent efforts for Hess's early release, which ultimately failed. He committed suicide in Spandau at an advanced age. Baldur von Schirach served as the organizer of the Hitler Youth for 2 decades. Albert Speer was also sentenced to 20 years, after which he would be released from prison and write an extensive memoir. Konstantin von Neurath served as the first foreign minister of Hitler's Germany for 15 years. 3 individuals were later pardoned: Franz von Papen, who was an ambassador to Turkey and played a role in assisting Hitler's rise, as he belonged to the old German elite; Hjalmar Schacht, the Reich Minister of Economy, who was not held accountable for the forcible expropriation of valuables or the occupied territories; and surprisingly, Hans Fritzsche, the voice of Goebbels on the radio, was acquitted. These outcomes mark the verdicts from Nuremberg. The executions took place on October 16th in Nuremberg. Each individual arrived at the scaffold under different circumstances, details of which are well documented. Notably, Julius Streicher was dragged to the gallows and reportedly wet himself in fear, while a voice yelled, "Heil Hitler!" nearby. However, Hermann Goering escaped hanging because he committed suicide the day prior, on October 15th. Questions arose regarding the source of the cyanide found in his cell. An American guard later mentioned that he and Goering frequently discussed politics and life, and there were rumors that he might have received a bribe from Goering's wife, his lawyers, or that he concealed the cyanide ampule under the toilet rim. Ultimately, Goering was found dead on October 15th. In his memoirs, Albert Speer claimed that he had possessed cyanide concealed in a jar throughout his imprisonment, hidden either in cream or toothpaste, but noted that he never used it. In a way, Goering also avoided execution. Nuremberg emerged as the prominent trial in a series aimed at prosecuting war criminals from the Third Reich. Additional trials, known as the Small Nuremberg Trials, took place in the American occupation zone, involving German judges, government lawyers, and economists. Crucially, leaders of the Sonderkommando and Einsatzgruppen were also tried, as these groups were responsible for the genocide of civilians and executed operations in territories occupied by the Third Reich. Numerous death sentences were handed down in these trials, alongside many proceedings held within Germany itself. Before returning to normal life, individuals needed to secure jobs in government agencies and undergo a process known as denazification, hence the term. In fact, there were a series of such trials. Recently, even a 97-year-old former guard was taken to court in Munich in a wheelchair. Israel has actively pursued German war criminals, believing, and justifiably so, that many had escaped justice. Notably, the notorious Dr. Mengele, who conducted experiments on living prisoners in concentration camps, was eventually located in Argentina, captured, and brought to Israel for trial, marking a significant legal proceeding. Nuremberg marked a significant milestone in the development of international law, involving extensive work and effort. Over the span of a year, the trial included 403 sessions and 216 court attendees, with approximately 240 witnesses giving their testimonies. Astonishingly, around 300,000 written statements were submitted, an impressive figure to consider. Every detail of the tribunal's proceedings was meticulously documented, resulting in a protocol totaling 16,000 pages. This comprehensive record showcases the monumental undertaking involved. Stalin did not reward anyone involved in the Nuremberg trials, perceiving this as a significant shortcoming of Soviet lawyers. He believed that the crimes of fascism, particularly those committed by Hitler's Germany, were not condemned as thoroughly or universally as he had anticipated. Numerous individuals evaded punishment, with 3 sentences resulting in the release of 3 defendants, including Hans Fritzsche, who infamously referred to Slavs as subhumans deserving extermination. Consequently, Stalin expressed considerable dissatisfaction with the outcomes of the Nuremberg trials. The question remains, what did the Nuremberg Tribunal ultimately contribute to humanity? Firstly, the trials established that aggressors must be held accountable, demonstrating a unique approach by the Allies to conduct a legal rather than political process. They meticulously examined a vast array of documents and dedicated significant time to this undertaking, opting against executing 50,000 Germans they deemed guilty. This systematic method marked a pivotal moment in history and set a crucial precedent for future actions. The Nuremberg trials were instrumental in the creation of significant human rights frameworks, giving rise to documents such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, the European Convention on Human Rights in 1950, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights in 1966. Additionally, UNESCO's 1954 document on the protection of cultural property was inspired by the evidence revealing extensive cultural destruction during the war. Nuremberg thus marked a fundamental turning point for international law, paving the way for the Geneva Conventions, the Genocide Convention, and tribunals like those for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. These foundational processes and their underlying principles can be traced back to the precedents set at Nuremberg. Alongside the appalling crimes and extreme brutality encountered during this period, when the term atrocities was often employed, particularly by the British, humanity also gained insight into the workings of the Third Reich. This regime relied on monumental deception, misleading its citizens as well as one another. At the trial, defendants claimed ignorance, insisting, "We knew nothing. That's not how things were. We didn't even understand our own situation." Indeed, this perspective holds true. To conclude, I would like to share a quote from Erich Maria Remarque that captures the essence of the era. Reflecting on Ribbentrop's twisted assertion that we were all merely shadows of Hitler, Remarque stated, "He embodied an abundance of cruelty, indifference, selfishness, ignorance, misguided sentimentality, amateurism, and cowardice, enough to shatter both the myth of the Führer and the legend of the master race." This highlights the insights gained from Nuremberg. Thank you for watching and wishing you all the best. Goodbye.